Vamos a dar pase ahora a la agenda de conferencias. Tras la excelente presentación de contexto de anoche a cargo del doctor Daniel Yergin, entramos de lleno en la materia de este encuentro. Empezaremos con el upstream, las funciones de exploración y producción de hidrocarburos que seguirán proveyendo la base de la oferta energética. Carlos Garibaldi, secretario ejecutivo de ARPEL, moderará la charla notable de Schreiner Parker sobre el nuevo escenario de negocios de exploración y producción en América Latina y el Caribe. Invito al señor Garibaldi a subir al estrado para que pueda presentar a su disertante. Bienvenido.
Bueno, buenos días a todos. Espero que estén disfrutando de la conferencia después de la inauguración de ayer. Ayer tuvimos una muy buena charla con Daniel Yergin que nos dio un panorama, digamos, global de lo que está pasando y cuál es el futuro de la industria del petróleo y del gas y la industria de la energía. Hoy bajamos un poquito más a lo cuantitativo y vamos a hablar también, nos va a dar Schreiner, va a pasar del enfoque global al enfoque latinoamericano. Así que nos metemos más en latinoamericano y lo hacemos un poco más cuantitativo. Schreiner es el vicepresidente senior y a cargo de América Latina, basado antes en México y ahora está basado en Río de Janeiro, de Rystad, una consultora de gran prestigio internacional. Schreiner se graduó con honores de la Universidad de Texas, con grados en español y en portugués, y después trabajó un número de años en una empresa, una firma de investigación y de consultoría, manejando su oficina, una empresa global, manejando su oficina de Río de Janeiro. Después recibió un máster en International Oil and Gas Management del Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies en Ginebra, en Suiza. Sus responsabilidades actuales incluyen estar a cargo de la investigación y de la consultoría en la región y también trabajar con las empresas nacionales del continente de la región, desarrollando relacionamiento con gobiernos, instituciones financieras, independientes, empresas de servicio y de energías renovables. La presentación de Schreiner habla perfecto español, pero la presentación va a ser en inglés y después vamos a tener nuestra charla de preguntas y respuestas en español. Así que le damos la bienvenida a Schreiner y el podio.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Carlos, por la introducción y estas palabras. Quiero hacer la presentación en inglés para ser más eficaz con el tiempo que nos queda, pero después podemos hacer las preguntas en español. Thank you again to everyone, and really excited to be here to share our views on the global situation and how that will affect Latin America going forward. To speak very quickly about Rystad Energy, we are a global firm with offices around the world, the headquarters office in Oslo, Norway, an independent firm wholly owned by our employees, providing data, analytics, and advisory services to clients exposed throughout the industry. And we've been in business since 2004, now with over 550 employees, energy experts working across our 20 different teams and 25 different offices worldwide. So I want to speak first about the macro environment that we see, and then we'll jump into the upstream trends for Latin America, speak a bit about cost curves, and then the production resiliency that we see for the region. So starting out, if you see the graph above, what we're looking at is the liquid supply from producing wells in development versus the total liquids demand in our different degree scenarios. And what this graph is really showing you is that we need more oil. The graph itself represents the base decline. So if you look at the brown, red, green, and orange wedges, that signifies the existing production. And if we were to have no new investment from 2022 on to today. This is the base decline that you would see. And so what this means is as we look out into 2030, 2040, 2050, there is a call for sanctioning and a call for new barrels to come to market. We'll focus on the 2030 part, we'll focus on the 2030 part momentarily, but I think it's worth looking at the longer picture here, which means that in the 2050 timeframe, if we use our mean scenario of 1.8 degree rise, we'll still need 42 million barrels a day to come from new sources. So that could be infill wells on existing fields or exploration. But in the shorter term, we need 63 million barrels a day to cover demand in our mean scenario by 2030. And again, these are liquid supplies that are from wells. The graph here that is showing is the liquid supplies from wells that are already sanctioned post-FID. So this 63 million barrels a day of new reserves has to come from a number of different sources. And if we look at that, it has to come from kind of all sources, right? But you can divide this into three distinct areas. So if you look at the far right, we have the need for supply in blue, which is the 63 million barrels a day that was mentioned. And then the new supply can be broken out into those three different components. So you have the OPEC Plus, which is the old fields. That's the infilled well drilling that represents about 25 million barrels per day of that 63, plus new fields within the OPEC Plus countries, which accounts for about 6. Then you have, on the left-hand side of the graph, the non-OPEC Plus sources of supply. So the infilled wells there could produce around 8 million barrels per day out to the 2030 timeframe, as well as the new fields or discoveries, exploration, which is 9 million barrels per day. And then there's a distinct area here, which is new shale oil, which accounts for 14 million barrels per day of that 63 total. So it's really, the supply really needs to come from a mixture of different sources, both OPEC Plus as well as non-OPEC Plus, and then shale playing an important part of that future supply to reach that 2030 demand figure. If we look at the cost of supply curve for pre-FID wells by 2030 by supply segment type, you can really see that onshore infield, particularly in the OPEC Plus countries, as well as shale or light tight oil, and offshore new wells are going to add the largest amount of new supply by 2030. And what we're trying to represent here is that if you're looking at a break-even of, call it 51, 52, which is the x-axis, US dollars per barrel, real Brent equivalent, and you see what volumes can be brought to market from these different supply segments, onshore infield from OPEC Plus countries really represents the largest amount of that at about 20 million barrels. Then that's followed by shale, which we'll get into that in a few different slides because I think it's a very interesting topic for Latin America, particularly Argentina, and then offshore new fields. So those alone account for the vast majority of this 63 million barrels per day that we'll need by 2030. And of course, offshore is a story that is currently dominated by Latin America, particularly Guyana and Brazil. So this is the mix of where globally these 63 million barrels are going to need to come from. But I think the real message here is that no matter what you see in the media or in the press, we are still in an environment where we need to be doing exploration, where we need to be finding new sources of oil to meet our immediate term, if you think of 2030 in that way, demand figure. I want to give just a quick view into our price scenario as well. So what we've shown here is our long-term price outlook, looking at our Sigma Plus scenario, which is a 2-degree scenario, our mean scenario, a 1.8 degree rise, and then our Sigma Minus, which is a 1.6 degree rise. And What we're showing here is that while there may be some weakness in oil prices in the market over the next few years due to potentially global recession fears and maybe a lack of growth in demand in the very short term, structurally we're set up in the medium to long term for a rather high or stable oil price in our mean scenario and our Sigma Plus scenario. Of course, the Sigma Plus scenario means that demand stays much higher, does not peak at the 107 million barrels a day of demand at 2025 as we have predicted, but actually continues to grow past that. Then oil becomes scarce and the price increases significantly. The opposite is true for the Sigma Minus, which is demand reduces significantly. EVs penetrate the market in a much quicker scenario than we're anticipating now, and therefore demand causes the lessening of demand causes a price drop. But in general, the orange line, or rather the yellow line, is what we see to be the mean case. So structurally, we feel like although there may be weakness in the second half of this decade, we're actually very set up for a medium to long-term bull market in oil prices, which will underpin the longer-term investments that we'll look at as we dive into Latin America in specific. So I wanted to jump from the macro environment to the Latin American environment and talk about these kind of four distinct points, and we'll go into each of these in a bit of detail. But I think it's particularly interesting to look at the exploration well count for Latin America. We're including the Caribbean region, Guyana and Suriname, as a part of this analysis. We obviously saw between 2019 and 2020 a significant decrease in the number of exploration wells drilled in Latin America, and I think that was something to be expected considering the global pandemic that we went through, and this actually holds true for most regions of the world. But we have seen a recovery in the exploration well numbers in 2021 and 2022, tapering off a little bit in 2023 as companies and people and governments begin to concentrate on developing what has been found. If you look at the yearly discovered resources, of course, there's that huge jump from 2016 to 2017, and then that figure was maintained really throughout 2020. A lot of this story, of course, is Guyana, which, as Daniel Jurgen had said yesterday, is almost unprecedented in terms of the exploration success that's happened there within the last, within the less than 10 years, going from sort of zero recoverable reserves to over 11 billion in that time frame. So a lot of this story is underpinned there in the yearly discovered resources, but of course we've seen discoveries in other places, including Mexico, Brazil, and others as well. The total investments in terms of the development capex is, I think, the most interesting story on this slide, because we go from that low in 2020 of 28 billion to a high of kind of 45 to 46 billion in the 2024 to 2025 timeframe, and that really corresponds to what we've seen from the discovered resources and all the activity that took place with these exploration wells from the prior years. So now the story is really becoming taking these discoveries and moving them from a discovered resource to producing assets. And then the final graph here is the hydrocarbon production, which has maintained relatively steady if you're looking at the barrel of oil equivalent figure, but you do see that uptick again from 2020 out to 2025 in total terms. This is something that I think this development capex will begin to affect this story as we go further on out to the 2030 and 2035 timeframe, and we'll get into some of that as well. So I wanted to now look at the exploration activity and split this between offshore and onshore, and then look at this by different country in Latin America. And I think there's a few different stories in these slides that are worth telling. If we look at the offshore bit, I think the story that really calls attention, of course, is Guyana, which is represented in the green. This is something that we expect to continue. Exxon has no dearth of prospects to drill in the Stabroek Block, and we imagine that their pace will not diminish over the next few years. I think the other interesting story in this slide on the offshore part, of course, is Brazil, which is represented in purple. Brazil went through a period of, let's call it limited exploration between sort of the 2017 to 2020, 2021 timeframe. But we're seeing that begin to pick up now. And with the new election, we actually aren't really reversing our idea that this exploration will continue in Brazil, led by Petrobras, but also by the international partners that are there. Of course, Mexico calls attention as well. Exploration efforts are ongoing in the offshore space there, and there are commitment wells that are required to be drilled in the offshore space according to the licenses that were granted during the original opening. But nothing super material from an offshore exploration discovery perspective as of yet, so still a space that we're waiting to see. The onshore also has some interesting stories, and I think it's first important to caveat that the Argentina figures that you're seeing here are conventional exploration wells only, so this is not including shale wells, which account for a significant portion of the activity in Argentina onshore just now. But you can see the importance of shale represented inversely in this graph because of the diminishing number of onshore conventional exploration wells that are being drilled in Argentina from 2016 to 2023. A rather large number in 2016, almost negligible by 2023, which highlights the importance of the non-conventional efforts in Argentina. Then I think the other story that's interesting is Colombia. Colombia, of course, is represented in the sort of dark orange color there, and it's a significant number of exploration wells having been drilled there between the 2016 and 2019 timeframe, lessened in 2021, but looking forward to 2020, 2022, and 23, we still expect these wells to be drilled, and I think it's important to say why. Of course, we all know the election in Colombia, and the position of the Petro government has been broadly that they do not want to drill anymore. However, that needs to be nuanced in the fact that they will respect existing contracts, and so any contract that has been adjudicated that still requires exploration drilling, that exploration drilling will be permitted to continue. That's the latest news that we have out of Colombia, and I was actually there just 2 weeks ago interviewing the director of hydrocarbons at the Ministry of Mines and Energy. So we do expect that this exploration activity onshore will continue in Colombia as relates to contracts that had been adjudicated previous to Petro coming into power this year. So moving on, I want to look at the kind of investments, and we've definitely seen a recovery in total investments, both divided here between brownfield, greenfield, and exploration expenditure, 2020 being that low point, but a significant ramp up in the early part of this decade to the point where we see a high of $54 billion of total investment split between brownfield, greenfield, and exploration by 2024. That begins to taper off as we come to the second part of the decade, and that corresponds a little bit with the price softness that we talked about in the second half of the decade. But if we look at this from a kind of country perspective, Brazil, of course, is leading the way by far. Mexico, this one is interesting because this has the potential really to push to the right. We're not certain of this number. This is what has been communicated, and you can see on the bottom graph that Pemex actually leads the way in the number 2 position by investments by company from the 2021 to 2030 timeframe. But again, this is very much subject to push to the right, and it's done so previously, and we could see that again. But as of right now, this is what is being communicated to the market. But I would just put a major caveat on that. Apologies, because the colors are reversed on the top right-hand graph. Argentina is going to realize a significant amount of investment from the 2021 to 2030 timeframe in brownfield, which unfortunately is represented in blue, some formatting issue. But that brownfield development is what we classify as the shale, and that is going to be a major source of investment in Latin America in general, and Argentina in particular, going forward. Of course, Guyana, the majority of that is the development of the discoveries in the Stabroek Block, and you can see ExxonMobil in the investments by company occupying the 3rd spot with $35 billion to invest from now until 2030. So still a lot of money that's pouring into the region in all forms: brownfield, greenfield, and exploration. Looking at the total investments by supply segment group, the thing that really calls attention, and this is Latin America again in total, is that from 2020 to 2025, we see a compound annual growth rate of investment in the offshore deep water of 17%. And that's significant in a global context, because it really is an extremely high figure. Then the other thing that to call attention to on this slide is the shale tight oil compound annual growth rate of 7% between 2020 and 2025, meaning that the Vaca Muerta really has matured and taken on, grown some legs and taken on a significant uptick in investment over these next few years. I want to talk a bit about sanctioning as well. And what we've done here is we've looked at the major offshore projects that are sanctioned or to be sanctioned, and we've divided those by different facility types. So 2021 saw a rather robust sanctioning activity, and we expect that to taper off a bit in 2022 and then start to grow again in 2023 and 2024. What you can see with these different project names is that subsea tiebacks are going to be extremely important in terms of the development of offshore assets in Latin America, but FPSOs will continue to be probably the driving force in offshore development in Latin America, making Latin America the largest market for FPSOs globally. That's between, of course, Brazil and Guyana, but Brazil still commanding the lion's share of that market. This is something that I think we'll continue to see even as we go past 2025. FPSO development will become more cost-effective and something that's going to become really a staple of Latin American offshore as we move into the 2030s. But subsea tieback is also going to have have a very important place there. I want to just jump into now the kind of production potential. And so if we look at this sanctioning and then correspond that to the production potential, what we're showing is that we have a significant uplift in production for certain offshore producers in Latin America, Brazil being one of them, right? Between 2020 and 2030, we expect Brazil to add 2 billion barrels a day of production through the sanctioning activities that we were shown there represented. But I think the real story here, of course, is Guyana, which if you look in 2020, that green line starts almost at zero, and by the 2035 time frame ends at close to 2 billion barrels per day, 1.8 billion barrels per day of production. That uplift in production in that time frame is, again, almost unheard of. And it speaks to both the quality of the reservoir and the quality of the operator to be able to take something from discovery to production in such a short amount of time on so many different fields. And this is something that I think that will be applicable for all of offshore Latin America going forward, which is reducing that time from first oil to production. Typically something in the order of 7 years globally, reduced down to 4 years in Guyana, and potentially reduced kind of even further going forward. Just to kind of finalize here, I've got 2 more slides. I want to talk about the cost curves for that potential supply from the 2021-2025 sanctioning activities among the top offshore countries. So the graph that we're looking at here shows the cost curves for potential supply from 2020 to 2025, with the break-even oil price in USD on the x-axis per barrel, and then the y-axis the y-axis is the break-even oil price, and the x-axis the planned production capacity in 1,000 barrels per day. What we've done is divide this into kind of low risk, medium risk, and high risk, depending on that break-even oil price. So you can see the potential volumes that will come to market from those sanctioned activities. In a low-risk scenario, Brazil, Norway, and Guyana are sort of the leading offshore provinces, and that's that below $40 break-even. But then when we get into the sort of medium-risk scenarios, which is a break-even between $60 and $40, then Brazil really comes into its own, and that's where you get that sort of additional, call it 1.5 0.5 billion barrels that gets you into that 2 billion barrels of additional supply that we were referring to in the production chart out to 2035. So really, Guyana and Brazil from an offshore perspective, and Mexico to a certain extent in the mid-range scenario, have a very attractive cost curve for that potential supply going forward if we're able to kind of maintain the prices that we have today. Finally, I want to talk about the resiliency of offshore production, particularly in Latin America, relative to other sources. So the top graph is looking at the 2030 global oil cost of supply with million barrels per day on the x-axis, and then the y-axis is the break-even oil price. And you see that Guyana and the Brazilian pre-salt match up kind of very well with other sources of supply when it comes to that break-even cost. In fact, more competitive than Permian Basin production, although less competitive than your Saudi Arabia onshore and shelf, as well as other onshore Middle East, but fitting very nicely in the middle of that graph. And then looking at the emissions intensity, we see that deep water is actually a very advantaged source of supply when it comes to lower emissions intensity. In fact, it's about half of the global average, which is 18 kilograms of CO2 per BOE, and deep water being about 9 kilograms of CO2 per BOE. And so when we think about the production, when we think about the supply going forward into the 2030s, 2040s, and even 2050s, supply will need to have the 2 necessary and sufficient conditions to actually reach the market. And those necessary and sufficient conditions are 1, having a low break-even cost, and 2, having a low emissions intensity. So Latin American offshore is actually very well placed when it comes to being a long-term supplier to the global market, because it has both of those necessary and sufficient conditions, 1 being the low break-even, and the second being that low emissions intensity. With that, I'll finish my presentation and sit down with Carlos for a discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Schreiner. Creo que tenemos tiempo para 2 preguntas nada más, antes que me reten. me llamó la atención que en tus 3 escenarios de temperatura, de demanda de energía en función del incremento de temperatura, piden un sustancial incremento de producción, con un pico de 107 millones de barriles por día en 2025. Por ejemplo, en el escenario de 1,8 grados, y ya llama la atención que no es más 1,5, sino que es 1,8, llama que tiene que haber 63 millones de barriles de pozos nuevos para el 2030. El IEA dice que eso requiere desde 2020 a 2040 20 trillones de dólares de inversión, que equivale más o menos a 1 trillón por año. Y la pregunta es, ¿estamos como industria invirtiendo lo suficiente en exploración y producción como para llegar a ese gol y llenar ese gap en la demanda de energía?
Bueno, es cierto que hemos pasado una fase de subinversión, ¿no?, mundialmente en los últimos, digamos, 7 años. Por ejemplo, cuando hablamos de la tasa de reemplazo de reservas globales, antes de 2015 era como 70%, lo que significa que todo lo que fue producido en un año, 70% de este volumen fue encontrado en esfuerzos exploratorios. Desde 2015 hasta hoy, la cifra sigue bajo de 10%, ¿no? Entonces es un poco, asustante. Y nosotros estamos sufriendo eso ahora mismo, ¿no? Falta de inversión. Nosotros pensamos que hay 2 factores que nos han salvado, ¿no?, un poco en esto. Uno, que es el precio de un pozo por promedio ha bajado, tanto en el offshore como en el onshore, ¿no? El segundo factor es que los pozos que tenemos hoy en día son más productivas que los pozos antiguos, ¿no?, los pozos que tuvimos en el pasado. Entonces, esta mezcla, ¿no?, de tener pozos menos costosos y más productivos nos han llegado a un lugar en donde tenemos producción suficiente para llegar a la demanda, pero solo eso, ¿no? Nosotros sí vemos que en este año, mundialmente hablando, inversiones de exploración y de desarrollo van a aumentar 20%, ¿no?, mundialmente, y el año que viene entre 10 a 12%, ¿no? Pero todavía hay inversión para realizar, ¿no? Por ejemplo, hay ciertos actores, las empresas nacionales de petróleo acá en América Latina, quien puede invertir más, ¿no? Y todavía están restringiendo un poco la inversión que deberían hacer para que tenemos la cantidad suficiente de petróleo para llegar a la demanda cuando llegamos a 2030.
Sí, es un poquito un catch-22, porque tenemos que invertir para satisfacer la demanda y va a provocar mucho ruido que aumentemos la inversión en petróleo y gas, sobre todo en las instituciones financieras. Ahora, bajamos a Latinoamérica, del panorama general, y también me llamó la atención. Todos acá entendemos que tenemos una oportunidad muy significativa para Latinoamérica para que incremente su producción en respuesta a la crisis de seguridad energética, ha pasado de ser un episodio a ser algo estructural. Así que tenemos un horizonte de no corto plazo, ¿no?, para cubrir. Sin embargo, tu gráfica muestra realmente moderadamente modestas, ¿no?, aumentos en capital, en gastos de capital, en el onshore y en el offshore, y en la producción resultante. Entonces, mi pregunta es, ¿por qué? ¿Por qué no aprovechamos esta oportunidad? ¿Cuáles son los desafíos particulares que tiene nuestra región para lograrlo? Y si nos perderemos el tren.
Bueno, buena pregunta, y creo que es una mezcla de factores, ¿no?, que tiene que ver con esto. Primero quiero decir que nosotros hemos visto que en términos de los majors, América Latina es uno de los lugares en el mundo en donde están creciendo la inversión de ellos, ¿no? En vez de otros lugares en donde están saliendo, ¿no? Entonces reconoce tal vez la importancia de esta región cuando hablamos principalmente del offshore, ¿no? Que es donde los majors típicamente le gustan de jugar. Creo que cuando hablamos, hay una falta de inversión que viene de las empresas nacionales de petróleo y también de los independientes, ¿no? Aquí en América Latina. Y eso creo que tiene que ver con el riesgo above ground, ¿no? que hay. Algo que no es nuevo en América Latina, pero está llamando mucha atención hoy en día en las elecciones que ha pasado la mayoría, si hablamos de los últimos 5 años, en la mayoría de los países, ¿no? Hemos visto una vuelta a la izquierda de Nuevo, y creo que por inversionistas y empresas privadas de petróleo han dado un asusto, ¿no? Y este riesgo de above ground parece más alto ahora que antes. Entonces, es algo que los gobiernos deberían, en la región, deberían asegurar a los inversionistas y los diferentes jugadores en papeles independientes, que las inversiones están seguros y que todos reconocen la necesidad para invertir en este sector, ¿no? Tanto por el beneficio que reciben las poblaciones, ¿no? de estos países, pero también hablando mundialmente para llegar a la cifra de producción necesaria, ¿no? Para llegar a la demanda.
Bueno, y por último, y para terminar, una cortita, y no sé si la querés o podés contestar o no, pero hay un elefante en la habitación, ¿no? Que es que más o menos, aproximadamente, groseramente, 2/3 de las reservas y los recursos de hidrocarburos de Latinoamérica están en Venezuela. Entonces, ¿qué va a pasar? No, me imagino que no está contemplado en tus gráficas el aumento de producción en Venezuela, pero ¿se destrabará? ¿Venezuela triunfará el realpolitik finalmente?
Venezuela es un caso interesante. Hace años que tenía la oportunidad de visitar Caracas y qué pena porque es un lugar maravilloso, pero creo el siguiente, ¿no? Ahora están produciendo alrededor de 700 millones de barriles por día. Si los Estados Unidos cortan las sanciones y si PDVSA y los socios tienen acceso a diluente, pueden aumentar la producción hasta 1 millón de barriles por día. Y allí está el techo, ¿no?
Okay.
Si quieren lograr tener producción encima de 1 millón de barriles por día, hay que tener una inversión enorme, ¿no? de capital para mejorar toda la degradación que ha pasado en los últimos 10 años, ¿no? Tanto en infraestructura como en recursos humanos, ¿no? Personas capaces, ¿no? de hacer este tipo de trabajo. Entonces, en el corto plazo, no veo que Venezuela puede aumentar producción en una manera significativa. En el largo plazo, para tener este tipo de inversión que tiene que suceder ahora mismo, ¿no? Para tener un efecto en el futuro, pues un gran cambio será necesario, ¿no? Creo que el riesgo es demasiado para alguien como Chevron o los demás invertir tanto en una situación política tal como es.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Ha sido muy esclarecedor. Nos bajaste a tierra con números y un gran aplauso para Schreiner.
Gracias. Muchísimas gracias.